Fun fact: Joesph Medicine Crow was the last war chief of the Crow Nation, achieving the status while fighting the Nazis in Europe during World War II. To become a war chief, Joesph had to pass 4 tests while at war. He had to take an enemy's weapon, he had to touch a living enemy without killing them, he had to lead a successful war party, and finally, he had to sneak into an enemy camp and steal a horse. Joesph was born on a Crow Nation reservation in Montana in 1913, and he learned the traditions of the Crow Nation from a young age and came from a long lineage of Crow Nation war heroes. Joseph's tribe's history inspired him to study history and anthropology in college, and in 1939 he became the first member of the Crow Nation to earn a master's degree. But on his way to his doctorate, he left university and volunteered for the army. Before battles, Joesph Medicine Crow painted 2 red war stripes on his arms in the Crow tradition. He also carried a yellow eagle feather into battle with him that was given to him by a Sundance medicine man. During a raid in France, Joesph encountered a German soldier alone in an alley. He knocked the German's weapon out of his hands with his rifle, thus taking a weapon from an enemy, and he took the German soldier captive, touching a living enemy without killing him. During a tense moment for his company, while they were surrounded by German soldiers, Joseph's commanding officer put him in charge of a mission to take 7 men to go get more ammunition and bring it back to the front lines. Joesph led the mission successfully, turning the tide of the battle and saving his company. Now, you might not think horses would still be used in war by the 1940s, but due to the limited access to oil, horses were still heavily relied on to transport artillery and supplies. During the final days of the war, during a German retreat, Joesph tracked a group of Nazi SS soldiers escaping on horseback. Joesph followed the troop until they came to rest in a pasture where they camped for the night. Joseph's company surrounded the German troops, but before they attacked, Joesph suggested to his commanding officer maybe he should go free the horses so none of the German soldiers could escape on horseback once they began their assault. His commanding officer agreed, and Joesph snuck into the enemy camp, created a bridle from a short piece of rope as Crow warriors had been doing for centuries, and then leapt onto a horse and rode away, leading a stampede of 50 more horses. As he rode out of range, his army division launched their attack, and Joesph sang a Crow Nation praise song as he rode his horse back to camp. When Joesph Medicine Crow returned home from the war, the elders named him War Chief, and he also earned a Bronze Star and a French Legion of Honor for his service. In 1948, Joesph became the official Crow Nation historian and anthropologist, and wrote the script for the reenactment of the Battle of Little Bighorn, based off the oral histories he had been told as a child. In 2009, Joesph was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and at 95 years old, performed a ceremonial dance after receiving the medal. Joesph died in 2016 at 102 years old. The only other member of the Crow Nation to come close to achieving war chief status since Joesph Medicine Crow was his nephew, Carson Walks Over Ice, who fought as a Green Beret in Vietnam. Carson managed to complete 3 of the 4 requirements, but was not able to steal a horse. He did, however, manage to steal 2 elephants, which he believed should have counted for something. Carson Walks Over Ice was brought up in a traditional Crow Nation home, and in September of 1964, Carson enlisted in the U.S. Army paratroopers immediately after finishing high school at the age of 18. He completed the training program and then spent a couple years in the Panama Canal with the Army. In 1967, he volunteered to go to Vietnam because he wanted to do his war deeds, just as his uncle Joesph Medicine Crow had done during the Second World War. Carson Walks Over Ice was a Green Beret and a platoon sergeant, meaning he was frequently dropped behind enemy lines and was in charge of 47 men. Since the Viet Cong were very good at identifying officers and people in charge, American soldiers would avoid wearing insignia on their uniforms. So Carson Walks Over Ice would put an eagle feather in the netting of his helmet, so when he was giving orders, his troops would know it was him talking. This also takes care of one of the war chief requirements. Carson Walks Over Ice led many successful war parties. Carson Walks Over Ice had gone to Vietnam to become a war chief. He carried a piece of rope in his knapsack at all times and was always looking for a horse to steal, but he never saw any. During a firefight, a Viet Cong soldier came running past Carson Walks Over Ice through the brush. Carson grabbed the Viet Cong soldier, took his weapon, looked at him, and in Vietnamese said, "Run," releasing the enemy back into the jungle. The other soldiers in Carson's platoon were shocked. They asked Carson, "Why did you let him go?" Carson replied, "The important thing is that you saw me do it. That's all you need to know," completing the tasks of taking an enemy's weapon and touching a living enemy. Carson Walks Over Ice continued to look for a horse, but the Viet Cong just didn't have them. Then one day, while he was on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, Carson heard a crackle in the bush and looked up to see an elephant being ridden by a Viet Cong soldier. Carson shot the soldier, which startled the elephant and caused it to come running towards him. The elephant had a chain hanging around its neck which was dragging on the ground, and when the elephant ran up to Carson, he grabbed onto the chain and hung onto it until the elephant came to a halt. When the elephant did finally come to a stop, he noticed there was a second elephant tied to the first elephant, and both of them were loaded with guns and ammunition. Carson took the 2 elephants and led them back to his camp. So Carson figured when he got home, he would get credit for a horse. But when he did get home and told the elders what had happened, they shook their heads and said, "Sorry, Carson, elephants are not horses." And Carson was denied war chief status because he had not been able to steal a horse, just 2 elephants. Carson Walks Over Ice was wounded twice during the Vietnam War and was medically discharged in April of 1968. Carson lived with a bullet in his leg for the rest of his life. Carson Walks Over Ice earned a total of 14 medals, commendations, and badges during his time serving in the military. After his time in the military, Carson earned a major in business administration, minoring in German studies, and he was fluent in German, Crow, Latin, and Spanish. His children nicknamed him the walking computer because he always had the answer to every question. Carson died in 2011 at the age of 65.